Welcome, curious minds. If you thought history was all war, dates, and dusty scrolls, you're in for something else entirely. Today we dive into a bizarre corner of royal history, a story so strange, so embarrassingly human, it was almost scrubbed from the books. It's the tale of a king, a throne, and a very fatal trip to the bathroom. Our journey begins not in a battlefield or a palace banquet, but in a private chamber where the fate of an empire's ruler was sealed, not by assassins or revolutionaries, but by something far more humble: digestion. He was a man of order, predictability, and pride. George Augustus, known to the world as King George II, ruled Great Britain and Ireland in the 18th century. And though his reign oversaw wars, treaties, and political shifts, it was his death, one so absurd it echoed through gossip circles for decades, that would come to define his legend among commoners. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. The king had risen early, as he always did, and took his tea in silence. His valet, Mr. Schroeder, noted nothing unusual about the king's mood. He read correspondence from the evening before, consulted the morning brief, and retired to his private lavatory, an elegant mahogany-seated commode located within his chambers at Kensington Palace. No one thought twice. Kings have their routines, and George's was as punctual as the sunrise. But minutes passed, then more. The silence grew louder. When Schroeder knocked and received no answer, he entered and found the king collapsed on the floor beside the toilet. Alarm spread through the palace like fire. Doctors were summoned, but the king was already gone. He had died on the spot. So what killed him? The official post-mortem concluded something unexpected. The king suffered a rupture in the right ventricle of his heart, an aortic aneurysm, triggered, they claimed, by the strain of defecation. Put simply, George II died of a massive heart rupture while trying to poop. As grotesque as it may sound, it's not entirely unheard of, even in modern medicine. Valsalva maneuvers, straining during bowel movements, can spike blood pressure and, in rare cases, rupture weakened vessels. But in 1760, such a cause of death for a monarch was shocking. Whispers filled the taverns. The king had literally died on the throne, but there was more to the story. Rumors of chronic constipation had followed George for years. Court physicians, using the best remedies of the age, rhubarb tinctures, enemas, and herbal laxatives, had tried to address it. But royal diets were rich, starchy, and low in fiber. A commoner might suffer in silence. A king suffered with protocol. Behind the walls of Kensington, the king's health had been deteriorating, though the court spoke of it only in hushed tones. And yet George himself clung to discipline, rarely deviating from his routines. There's an irony in it all. A monarch obsessed with control, undone by a force so primal. No battle, no scandal, no rival, just the slow, steady failing of a human body. As the palace prepared his body for royal burial, the cause of death became a quietly kept fact, mentioned only in confidential reports. But the people talked. They always do. And so begins our strange journey through a tale that sits at the intersection of power, biology, and history's strangest ends. This is just the beginning. If death on the toilet sounds like a cruel joke from the gods, then life inside the palace wasn't much more forgiving. For the days that followed George's passing, courtiers scrambled to preserve dignity and spin the story. The news of the King's death travelled fast, but the details, those were selectively edited. The king passed away peacefully in his private quarters, read the official dispatch to the press. No mention of the bathroom, no mention of the aneurysm, and certainly no mention of the very undignified position he was discovered in. But Londoners are no fools. Royal servants talked. Gossip leapt from housemaids to merchants, from noble dinner tables to the streets. "He croaked on the crapper," said one coachman to his fare, drawing roars of laughter. For Prime Minister Lord Bute, the timing was both disastrous and golden. George's heir, his grandson George III, was young and untested, but Bute saw potential. More importantly, he saw influence. The older king had grown increasingly isolated, cantankerous, and suspicious of his advisers. Bute, ever the political animal, moved swiftly to ensure the transition would favor his own position. But not everyone shared his optimism. Within the royal household, especially among the German retainers who had served George II since his Hanoverian days, the grief was sharp and bitter. The king had favored his German advisers, kept a separate court, and often clashed with his own ministers. Some wept openly, others stewed in anger. Behind closed doors, the physicians convened. Sir William Duncan, the royal doctor, insisted that the heart rupture had been inevitable. But there were murmurs among his colleagues. Had the king's chronic constipation been mismanaged? Could this have been prevented? And what of the laxatives, the endless rhubarb syrups and castor oil treatments? One young surgeon, fresh from Edinburgh, dared to suggest that the king's condition had been worsened by stress and by the very treatments administered to help him. Enemas administered too frequently, he claimed, might have weakened the colon, but his theories were quickly dismissed. No one wanted scandal, especially with a new monarch being fitted for a crown. Meanwhile, the late king's body lay in state. The embalmers worked in haste. Rumour had it that George's body had already begun to bloat due to internal bleeding. His intestines, once distended by pressure, were now collapsed. One physician reportedly fainted while performing the internal inspection. Another refused to speak of what he saw. The funeral, held at Westminster Abbey, was dignified, sombre and shrouded in black. As per tradition, no one mentioned the true cause of death during the eulogy. They spoke of bravery, stability, and legacy. But in the taverns, the truth spread. "He died trying to squeeze out his sins," one drunk whispered, raising a mug. "Poor bastard." Another replied, "If only he'd eaten more cabbage." The humour was brutal, but beneath it lay an unease, an uncomfortable reminder that no one, not even a king, escapes the indignities of the human body. As George III took the throne, he would be haunted by this story, not just because it embarrassed the royal name, but because it exposed a truth every monarch fears. Power means nothing when nature calls, and for those closest to the old king, the questions remained. Could they have done something more? Did his pride cost him his life? Or was this simply fate, a strange, scatological twist to a life otherwise defined by duty and decorum? Only time would tell. But for now, the throne was empty, and history had taken a most unusual turn. Morning after the king's death, the corridors of Kensington Palace were heavy with silence. Grief had its place, of course, but so did logistics. Monarchs may die in private, but their bodies and their legacies must be handled with relentless protocol. Lord Chamberlain, always the one to manage the royal household's most delicate affairs, was immediately summoned. His boots echoed down the marble floors as he made his way to the king's chamber, his expression stoic, but his stomach quietly knotted. This wasn't the kind of royal death that could be dressed in glory. It had to be controlled, contained, and carefully rewritten. Already a flurry of correspondence had begun. Seals were broken, riders dispatched. George III was informed in writing before being addressed in person. The young heir, not yet 23, sat in stunned silence as the message was read aloud. "He is gone," the page whispered. "Your Majesty." George didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the flickering candle before him, as if trying to understand the weight of that title now thrust upon him. His grandfather, though often stern and emotionally distant, had been the towering figure of his childhood. Now he was history, quite literally. Back at Kensington, a new problem surfaced. One of the attending physicians had been overheard describing the king's death in vivid terms to a servant. "It ruptured like old canvas," the man said, gesturing to his chest. The servant, a kitchen lad with a loose tongue, carried the story, straight to the under-butler, and from there it spiraled outward. Within a day, the death had already been satirized in broadsheets. "The king who was taken mid-strain," they joked. Drawings circulated among London's less reputable printers, showing a regal figure slumped over in a wooden lavatory. Some were cruel, others outright obscene. For the crown, the damage was clear. The longer the true story lingered, the more. In power it had to humiliate, but squashing a rumor in 1760 was like trying to put out fire with your hands. It only spread faster. Meanwhile, George III was preparing for the transition. He consulted with Lord Bute, whose presence became increasingly dominant. The two were close, perhaps too close for the comfort of certain ministers, and Bute wasted no time stepping into the vacuum of influence left behind by the late monarch. "You must act swiftly," Bute advised the new king, "not just with policy, but with image." And so it began, a quiet, calculated campaign to distance the new reign from the final, unflattering moments of the last. Painters were summoned to update royal portraits. Tapestries were altered. Even the king's private journals were reviewed, with certain entries quietly removed from public record. In the public-facing version of history, George II passed away in his study, seated in reflection, overcome by sudden heart failure. No bathroom, no bowel movement, just a tidy, graceful death. But inside the palace the full truth remained. The Queen Dowager, Caroline of Ansbach, had passed years earlier, but her former ladies-in-waiting whispered that the king had suffered from digestive troubles for decades. He drank too little water, one recalled. He insisted that wine was more noble. Another nodded, recalling how often the king had ordered roast goose for breakfast, followed by thick pudding and a slice of cured ham. His diet was that of a man who never believed he'd age, she said. Meanwhile, in the kitchens, cooks took stock of ingredients. Would the new king favor the same greasy staples, or might he usher in a more delicate, healthier cuisine? The question wasn't culinary, it was political. To serve a king was to anticipate his health, his temperament, and his legacy. And what of Schroeder, the valet who discovered the king's body? He had been sent away quietly, offered a generous pension and a small estate in Surrey, on the condition he never speak of what he saw. But the trauma stayed with him. For years he would recount the moment, not in words, but in silence. He stopped speaking altogether, they said, and when visitors pressed him, he would only shake his head and pour another glass of claret. Not. Far from Kensington, a playwright named Tobias Fielding caught wind of the king's death and began writing a farcical play, The Royal Flush. Though the play was never performed publicly due to censorship, its manuscript survived, passed between theatre circles in hushed laughter. In it, a bumbling king is visited by the ghosts of meals past, each representing a different vice: gluttony, pride, and ignorance. In the final act, the king explodes, literally on a golden toilet. Art imitates life, and life, sometimes, is stranger than fiction. But for all the mocking and whispers, a quieter grief persisted among those who had served George II loyally. The royal guard wore black armbands, church bells tolled. And amidst the ridicule, there were those who remembered the king not as a victim of a humiliating death, but as a man of consistency, if not warmth. He was never beloved in the way some monarchs are. He lacked the charm of his ancestors or the eloquence of his successors, but he was firm, reliable, and for most of his reign unshaken. Still, the body told its truth, and as surgeons studied the ruptured aorta, some began to speculate. Was this truly the fault of the Valsalva maneuver, a single moment of strain, or had something more sinister been at play? Poison, perhaps? Intentional neglect? A silent assassination by means of medical misdirection? Theories emerged, though few dared voice them aloud. After all, what better disguise for a regicide than death by toilet? The whispers would remain, just like the stain on history. And as the new king settled into power, as portraits of the late George II were quietly removed from the grand staircase, the final irony lingered in the minds of those who knew. A monarch who ruled over an empire, a man whose word could change the fate of millions, reduced in the end to the same mortality we all face. And in that, perhaps, there was a strange sort of justice. He was, in the end, just a man, and his throne, however gilded, could not save him. George III's ascension to the throne brought a different atmosphere to the monarchy, a shift in temperament, ideology, and public image. Yet no matter how tightly the new regime tried to close the book on the circumstances of the old king's death, the whispers persisted. What the court couldn't erase was the ripple effect it had on the public psyche. In back alleys and royal salons alike, the question buzzed: how had a man so powerful died so helplessly? Beyond court politics and funeral protocol, a quiet reckoning was beginning among the king's physicians and advisers. Medicine at the time was a peculiar blend of science, superstition, and showmanship. The royal physicians had prided themselves on their refined methods: bloodletting, tinctures of opium and mercury, and the ever-popular enema. But behind closed doors, debates flared. Dr. Theodore Munson, a soft-spoken anatomist, had dissected the late king's heart and observed the rupture firsthand. To him, the cause was anatomical. The aorta, already thin and weakened by age and pressure, had failed under stress. The bowels may have triggered it, but the heart was the villain. Not everyone agreed. Dr. Richard Fells, a brash and rising surgeon, believed the real culprit was the relentless dosage of herbal purgatives: rhubarb root, senna leaves, and diuretic teas. The court had been dosing the king for years in an attempt to solve what he considered a structural, not functional issue: "We drowned his system in decoctions," Fells declared during a private meeting of the Royal College of Physicians. He was a man of advanced age and delicate constitution. These treatments didn't help. They unbalanced him further. Across town, in the drawing rooms of the educated elite, the king's death became a case study. The London Medical Gazette, newly published by a group of Enlightenment thinkers, featured an anonymous editorial, "A Monarch Undone by Meals." It questioned the effectiveness of the court's remedies and called for a new era in dietary health. "Let kings eat as the peasants do," it read. "More cabbage, fewer claret." Even foreign dignitaries weighed in. A letter from the French ambassador to the Comte de Choiseul described the late George as a man too enamored with meat and mistrustful of greens. The phrase became an inside joke in Versailles, where courtiers toasted their digestion after dinner in mock tribute to the British king. Back in England, the new monarch faced an uphill battle. George III was cautious by nature, but also ambitious. He recognized that his grandfather's legacy, though outwardly respectable, was undermined by the unflattering details of his final moments. He ordered his portraitist to depict him in full regalia, not as a man, but as a symbol. No vulnerability, no softness, but symbols don't stop rumors, and rumors love detail. A new detail emerged from one of the laundry maids who'd been tasked with clearing the king's garments. The royal undergarments, she said, had been soiled, and the odor had lingered in the chamber long after the body was removed. Her words, relayed to a cousin and then a local baker, eventually reached a playwright in the East End who crafted a satirical poem. "He ruled with might, he ruled with grace, but left the world with soiled lace, a crown of gold upon his head, a porcelain seat his final bed." The poem spread in handwritten copies throughout London, reaching even the halls of Oxford and Cambridge. Young scholars debated the indignities of royal life. Professors used the event to illustrate the dangers of unmoderated medical intervention. And students, ever bold, recited the poem aloud at taverns and public squares. For every laugh, though, there was also discomfort. The king's death exposed something that many wished to ignore, the unavoidable truth that human bodies, regardless of title, obey nature's law. The poor, who often died in their own waste, suddenly found a strange kinship with the man who had worn the imperial crown. Meanwhile, a different story was unfolding behind palace walls. Princess Amelia, daughter of George II, had been one of the few royals close to the late king in his final years. She was devastated by the ridicule and the implication that his death had somehow been undignified. She began a quiet campaign of her own. She spoke publicly about her father's strength, his commitment to order, his resilience in the face of political pressure. In letters to foreign courts, she framed his death as a sudden cardiac failure, omitting any reference to toilets or digestive complications. Her goal was clear: to restore a sense of royal dignity. She even commissioned a private memorial, a marble plaque that read, "He ruled with reason, he died with honor. His heart, broken not by age, but by burden." Few ever saw the inscription. It was placed not in Westminster Abbey or any royal hall, but in a small chapel near the royal stables, a quiet place her father had enjoyed visiting on mornings before court. And so two versions of the story took shape, one told in shadowed corners and whispered laughter, where caricatures and rhymes shaped the memory of a king brought low by his own body, and another, carefully guarded and officially endorsed, where the king died as kings are supposed to, in dignity, in silence, and surrounded by loyalty. Both versions were true in their own way. Both lingered, and both would follow George III as he sought to define his reign in contrast, not just to his grandfather's policies, but to his final moments. Because if there was one thing every monarch knew, it was this: you may control armies and write laws, but in the end, your story belongs to those who tell it next. The court was abuzz with whispers, but the real contest for George III was not fought in salons or taverns. It was waged deep within the corridors of power and the chambers of his own mind. The young king was acutely aware that the shadow cast by his grandfather's ignominious death stretched longer than any royal decree or public appearance. He convened a secret council of advisers, men not only skilled in politics, but versed in the growing science of medicine and public perception. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Harrow, one of the few female physicians permitted unofficial influence. She brought a perspective rooted in the Enlightenment's ideals of balance, hygiene, and reason. "Your Majesty," she began in a hushed voice, "during their first meeting, we must address the fears that the public harbors, not just about health, but about power and vulnerability. If we continue to ignore the human element, the court will become a subject of mockery rather than reverence." George nodded slowly. "Then what do you propose?" "We launch a campaign to change the conversation," she said, "one that honors the body as a temple worthy of respect and care, not as a fragile vessel to be overwhelmed by excess. We start with diet, physical exercise, and most importantly, transparency about health, without inviting scandal." The king pondered. The idea, a royal fitness regimen, public health advisories, it was unorthodox, but could forge a new image. A monarch who ruled with both strength and wisdom, embracing modern science rather than hiding from it. Within months, the palace kitchens shifted their menus. Roasts and heavy sauces gave way to seasonal vegetables and lighter fare. The king was seen riding horses early in the morning, a sight that thrilled the populace. The London newspapers began to report on the king's new regimen, praising his vigor and self-control. Yet change was not easy. Old courtiers grumbled behind closed doors. Some physicians, steeped in tradition, resisted the subtle reforms. The royal apothecaries lamented the loss of lucrative tonic sales. And the poets of the East End, sensing their source of inspiration drying up, crafted darker satires. One poem that circulated read, "The king once ruled from porcelain throne. Now he rules from flesh and bone. Will balance save or soon betray a crown that shudders day by day?" Despite the jeers, George III remained steadfast. He knew the true battle was not only for his legacy, but for the very nature of monarchy in a changing world. Meanwhile, Princess Amelia continued her quiet mission, but now with her nephew's subtle blessing. Together, they commissioned artists and writers to craft a more nuanced portrayal of the royal family, one that acknowledged human frailty without surrendering dignity. In the realm beyond politics, the king's death and its aftermath spurred advancements in medicine. Dr. Munson's anatomical findings became widely studied, influencing surgeons across Europe. Dr. Fells's criticisms led to more cautious uses of purgatives and heralded a shift toward gentler treatments. Even the London Medical Gazette took a more balanced tone, celebrating progress while reminding readers of the lessons learned from the past. Years passed, and George III's reign grew into its own. The scandal that once threatened to tarnish his grandfather's memory became a catalyst for change, medical, cultural, and political. And in the quiet chapel near the royal stables, Princess Amelia's marble plaque remained, a solemn reminder that beneath every crown lies a fragile heart, often burdened beyond measure. For every king, the final truth remains. It is not how you fall, but how you rise afterward, that shapes your story. Despite the outward appearance of renewal and control, the royal court remained a web of shadows and intrigue. For every public triumph George III achieved, rumors and whispers lurked just beneath the surface, fueled by those who thrived on scandal and secrecy. The satirical poets had not vanished. They had only grown craftier. They spun tales of secret royal infirmaries, hidden ailments, and whispered curses. The king's faint cough during a council meeting sparked feverish speculation about his health. Every slight misstep, an awkward word, a flush of the face, became fodder for gossip. One night, in a smoky tavern in the heart of London, a shadowy figure recited a new poem to an eager crowd. Behind the mask of golden grace lies a heart that quickens pace. What secrets does the monarch keep, while the court pretends to sleep? Unbeknownst to the public, George III was not immune to doubt. The legacy of his grandfather's death haunted him in private moments. He spent long hours alone in the palace gardens, wrestling with the weight of expectation and the fragility of his own health. One evening, Dr. Elizabeth Harrow found the king seated beneath a great oak, staring at the stars. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "even the strongest must sometimes show their scars." He looked at her, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I fear that no matter what I do, the story of my grandfather's end will follow me like a shadow. The court wants strength, the people want a legend, but I am neither myth nor invincible." "Perhaps," she replied, "it is time to rewrite what strength means. Not in denial of weakness, but in the courage to face it." Inspired, George III began to share parts of his personal struggles with trusted advisors and close friends. His openness about mental and physical health, unprecedented for a monarch, slowly shifted public perception. A pamphlet circulated, anonymously but widely, titled "The King Among Men." It described the monarch's battles with illness and his determination to govern with empathy and resilience. It praised the king not for invulnerability, but for his humanity. The pamphlet's author was never revealed, but speculation ran rampant. Meanwhile, the court's physicians continued to innovate. New treatments emerged from the fusion of traditional remedies and Enlightenment science. The royal household became a beacon for progressive medicine, attracting scholars and healers from across Europe. Yet, the tension between tradition and change simmered beneath every banquet and ball. The old guard resisted, fearing loss of control. The new thinkers pushed for reform, driven by a vision of a healthier, more transparent monarchy. In this uneasy balance, George III ruled, not as the unblemished sovereign of legend, but as a man who bore his scars openly, challenging the court's masks and the public's expectations. As the years wore on, the story of the king who died from too much too much indulgence, too much treatment, too much silence became less about disgrace and more about the complexities of power and mortality. And in the end, it was not the poem in the taverns or the whispered rumors that defined the reign of George III, but the quiet strength of a monarch willing to be human. George III sat in his study late into the night, the flickering candle casting long shadows across the parchment strewn before him. The steady ticking of a clock was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Outside the window, the palace gardens were cloaked in moonlight, the world seemingly at peace. Yet within the walls of the palace, a storm of anxieties churned relentlessly in the young king's mind. He was not merely a ruler of a vast empire, he was a man wrestling with the inescapable legacies of the past. The death of his grandfather, man once revered, now whispered about in corners both grand and grim, was a spectre he could neither banish nor fully embrace. The whispered mockery, the satirical poems, the crude tales of soiled royal garments, these haunted the halls of his memory. More than the politics or the public, it was the vulnerability exposed by that death that gnawed at him. At the heart of his struggle lay a question that few dared ask aloud. Could a king remain powerful if he admitted to being human? For centuries, monarchs had cultivated images of invincibility, symbols of unassailable authority and divine right. To falter was to invite disaster, both personal and political. Yet George III had seen firsthand how the brittle facade of perfection could shatter, sending ripples of scandal and doubt throughout a kingdom. He had come to realize that the stories told about his grandfather's demise, the humiliations and the medical errors, were not merely about one man's failing body. They were about the limits of power itself, the limits of control, the limits of dignity, the weight of history. The young king had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited a history heavy with expectation and contradiction. His advisors, learned men of medicine and statecraft, urged him to present a facade of strength, to silence talk of weakness. A king must be a fortress, they told him. No cracks, no chinks in the armor. But George knew the truth was more complex. The human body was not a fortress, but a fragile vessel, and the mind behind the crown was even more delicate. At times, the pressure felt suffocating. The memory of his grandfather's final days, the relentless purging, the opiates, the bloodletting, weighed on him like a dark cloud. Those treatments had been a desperate attempt to wrest control from an uncontrollable body. Instead, they had hastened his decline. George had vowed not to repeat those mistakes. He began to work closely with Dr. Elizabeth Harrow, whose insights into physiology and holistic care offered a new path forward. Under her guidance, the king adopted a regimen of moderation, balanced meals, regular exercise, and mental rest. The palace, once a place of excess and rigid ceremony, slowly transformed into a place of measured health and cautious optimism. Yet, even as he took these steps, the king faced another adversary far more insidious, the Court of Shadows. The Court of Shadows. The court was a labyrinth of intrigue, where loyalty was often a mask and truth a dangerous weapon. For every public gesture of reform, there were whispers of conspiracy. Courtiers who thrived on gossip spun stories to discredit the king's resolve. They feared change, feared transparency, feared a monarch who showed vulnerability. Old nobles who had served his grandfather spread rumors that George's health was already failing, that his quiet hours in the gardens were signs of melancholy, or worse. They whispered that he was too soft, too introspective, unfit for the throne. Meanwhile, satirists and pamphleteers wielded their pens with sharpness, turning every misstep into fodder for public spectacle. The poem, "The King Among Men," circulated with increasing popularity, capturing the tension between the king's humanity and his royal duties. But George, fortified by his new circle of trusted advisers, refused to be cowed. In a bold move, he invited open discourse about the monarch's health, a radical act in a time when the very mention of a king's frailty was taboo. He authorized the publication of royal medical reports, carefully curated to present transparency without sensationalism. The gesture was met with shock, some outrage, but also growing respect. Public perception and the power of narrative. The shift in the royal narrative was subtle but profound. No longer was the king an unreachable god, but a man engaged in a shared human experience. The public, especially the burgeoning middle class, began to respond positively. The Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, and progress resonated with this new image of monarchy. The London Medical Gazette, once a venue for harsh critiques, published articles praising the king's openness and his commitment to medical reform. More importantly, George's efforts sparked a broader cultural conversation about health, dignity, and mortality. The idea that even kings could suffer, that their bodies could betray them, opened a space for empathy, a rare commodity in a hierarchical society. In taverns and parlors alike, debates flourished. The king was no longer just a distant figure of grandeur. He was a symbol of resilience and change, a son's burden, a father's resolve. But the weight of legacy was never far from George's heart. His relationship with Princess Amelia, his aunt, and one of the few family members who had known the old king intimately, remained a source of both strength and sorrow. Amelia had been a fierce protector of her father's memory, commissioning private memorials and carefully crafted letters to foreign courts. Her determination to preserve dignity clashed sometimes with George's desire for openness. Their private conversations were charged with emotion. "Your Majesty," Amelia once said, her voice trembling but resolute, "we must not allow his death to be a scandal that defines us, but nor can we silence the truth. There is strength in acknowledging our humanity and in honoring his memory through progress." George nodded, understanding that the path forward was fraught with delicate balances. He took her words to heart, recognizing that his reign was not just about politics, but about healing wounds, wounds within his family, his kingdom, and himself. The turning point. A public address in a defining moment. George III stood before the assembled Parliament and the nation, delivering a speech that would become legendary. He spoke not as an untouchable monarch, but as a man who understood the fragility of life and the weight of responsibility. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice steady but warm, "the crown I wear is heavy not only with gold, but with the burden of history, a history that reminds us all of our mortality. My grandfather's passing, marked by suffering and secrecy, taught us the dangers of ignoring the limits of our bodies and the perils of fear." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Let us embrace a future where power is tempered with wisdom, where strength acknowledges vulnerability, and where the health of the body and the spirit is a priority, not a secret. The speech was met with a mix of astonishment and applause. It marked a turning point, the moment when the monarchy, often seen as rigid and untouchable, began to breathe with the rhythms of real human experience. A legacy rewritten, the final. Years of George III's early reign were marked by cautious optimism and ongoing reform. Medical advancements flourished within the royal household and beyond. Public health initiatives were quietly encouraged, inspired by the king's personal example. Diet, exercise, mental well-being, once considered trivial topics for a monarch, became central themes of governance. The satirical poets lost some of their sharp edge, tempered by a public less eager to mock and more willing to understand. Princess Amelia's private memorial remained a quiet sanctuary, a testament to the king, who had died burdened but honored. Meanwhile, George III's portrait in the palace halls began to change, no longer a distant figure draped only in regalia, but a man with eyes that bore the knowledge of suffering and resilience. In the end, the story of the king who died from too much treatment, too much silence, too much expectation, became a story of balance between tradition and progress, between vulnerability and strength, between the crown and the man beneath it. George III's reign was not defined by the shadow of his grandfather's final moments, but by the light he cast forward, a light of courage, humanity, and hope. The turning tides of George III's reign rippled far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace and the stone-clad chambers of Westminster. While the monarch had taken unprecedented steps to humanize his rule, the world outside was itself a tempest of change, teetering between old regimes and new philosophies, between the iron grip of tradition and the winds of reform. And in this world, George's personal battles found echoes in the lives of millions. The people's king was in the streets and markets of London, the smoky pubs and bustling theatres. That George III's evolving image was tested and reshaped most vividly. The king, who had once been a distant, untouchable figure, now began to feel more like a people's monarch, albeit an uneasy title in a society still rigidly divided by class. His decision to open conversations about health, to admit vulnerabilities, long hidden, sparked a quiet revolution in public attitudes. People, from laborers to merchants, found in his example permission to talk about their own ailments, the aches and pains, the chronic struggles, the silent battles against nature's frailties. New clubs and societies dedicated to health and wellness began to spring up, inspired in part by royal patronage. These groups advocated for better sanitation, improved diets, and exercise, ideas once confined to elite salons now spreading among the working classes. The London Medical Gazette, once a bastion of academic elitism, became a forum for public education, publishing practical advice alongside learned essays. George's influence was evident in the tone, more inclusive, more hopeful, a monarch. Among men, despite this growing public connection, George III remained keenly aware of the delicate balance his position required. He was not a man who wished to become a populist, nor did he want to undermine the dignity of the throne. Instead, he sought to embody a new ideal, a sovereign who led not from aloofness, but from a place of shared humanity. One afternoon, during a rare visit to a hospital in Whitechapel, he walked among patients, listening to their stories. The experience moved him deeply. He later confided in Dr. Harrow, "Their suffering is raw and unvarnished. Yet in their eyes, I see a kind of courage that outshines any courtly pageantry. If the crown can do anything, it must protect and uplift." This courage, this resolve shaped many of his policies. Funds were allocated to improve urban sanitation. New laws promoted workplace safety. Education reforms emphasized health and hygiene. These moves were cautiously welcomed by Parliament and quietly lauded by the public, though they faced resistance from entrenched interests. The struggle within the palace, back within the palace. Not all embraced the king's vision. The court was still rife with factions. Some clung fiercely to the old ways, fearing that change would erode their influence. Others were opportunists, eager to exploit the king's openness for personal gain. Lady Margaret Fenwick, a sharp-witted and ambitious noblewoman, led one such faction. She whispered in drawing rooms that the king's humanity was a weakness to be exploited. She and her allies worked subtly to undermine Dr. Harrow's influence, spreading rumors about the Queen's health and questioning the king's capacity to rule. But George had learned the art of patience and discernment. Rather than confront Lady Margaret openly, he used quiet diplomacy and the loyalty of his new advisers to isolate her faction. The court's power dynamics shifted slowly, but irrevocably. The weight of mental shadows, while much attention had been given to the king's physical health, fewer knew of the darker battles within his mind. The hereditary history of mental illness, whispered about discreetly in royal circles, cast a long shadow over George. At times, the pressures of kingship, the memories of his grandfather's decline, and the relentless public gaze weighed heavily on him. Periods of deep melancholy, bouts of anxiety and exhaustion threatened his ability to govern. In these moments, Dr. Harrow's care became not only medical, but profoundly personal. She introduced the king to early forms of what would now be called psychotherapy, conversations to calm the mind, strategies to manage stress, and an emphasis on rest and reflection. George began to speak more openly about these struggles with his closest confidants. In private, he admitted, "The crown is a burden not only of gold, but of solitude. Sometimes the heaviest chains are those unseen." His honesty helped destigmatize mental health within the court, though it remained a delicate subject publicly. Yet seeds were planted for future generations to understand that the monarch, like his subjects, was vulnerable in mind as well as body. The people's voice and the press. The growing literacy and influence of the press played a crucial role in shaping and disseminating the new royal narrative. Newspapers, pamphlets and broadsheets buzzed with news of the king's reforms and personal journey, but the press was a double-edged sword. While many writers praised the king's openness, others seized on every stumble, every moment of frailty, to rekindle old scandals. To address this, George III took an unprecedented step. He established a royal press office to manage the flow of information and foster a more honest relationship with the public. This office aimed to provide accurate reports on the monarch's health and policies while discouraging sensationalism. Though the move was criticized by some as controlling or censorious, it largely succeeded in balancing transparency with dignity. Diplomacy. and the royal image abroad across the continent, foreign courts watched with interest and sometimes suspicion the evolving British monarchy. In France, the Comte de Choiseul and his successors had long mocked the British king's dietary habits and alleged bodily failures. But as George III embraced Enlightenment principles and reform, the tone shifted. French and other European diplomats noted his resilience and modern approach, with some even admiring the monarch who dared to admit human frailty while holding firm to power. Correspondences between courts became more nuanced, reflecting a Europe in transition, a continent where monarchs began to grapple with the same questions about authority, humanity, and legacy. The personal within the political. Despite the grand scope of reform and diplomacy, George III never lost sight of the personal. His family, particularly Princess Amelia, remained anchors in turbulent times. Their relationship, once strained by differing approaches to legacy and memory, softened into a partnership of mutual respect and shared purpose. Amelia's quiet campaigns to honor their grandfather's dignity found a new home in the broader reforms championed by her nephew. Together, they worked to balance remembrance with progress, honoring tradition while embracing change. The quiet revolution as the years passed. The story of the king who died from too much treatment, too much silence, and too much expectation faded from scornful mockery to a cautionary tale with lessons learned. George III's reign came to symbolize a quiet revolution, not one of violent upheaval, but of evolution in ideas about health, leadership, and humanity. In a society still divided by class and convention, his example bridged gaps, encouraging empathy and understanding across social strata. His reforms inspired future monarchs and leaders to consider the well-being of their people and themselves, planting seeds for modern ideas of governance that valued transparency, compassion, and balance. A legacy of strength and vulnerability. In the final pages of this chapter of history, George III stood not as a perfect king, but as a deeply human one. His reign was a testament to the idea that true strength comes not from denying weakness, but from facing it head-on. The crown he wore was heavy, yes, but it was carried with a courage that embraced imperfection. And in the end, the story of the king who died from too much poop was no longer just a tale of bodily failure or royal scandal. It was a story about the fragile, indomitable nature of power itself, and the men and women who wield it, imperfect and unbowed. George III knew that the transformation of a monarchy, especially one burdened by centuries of tradition and expectation, was no sudden revolution, but a slow, deliberate process. The cracks in the old order had begun to show, but they could not be rushed. They had to be carefully widened, polished, and reshaped. His reign was entering a new phase, one where the seeds planted in the shadows of past mistakes would now be nurtured in the light of cautious progress. Reform beyond the court. The king's interest in health and well-being was just the beginning. Inspired by the growing Enlightenment movement and influenced by trusted advisors, George III turned his attention to broader reforms that touched the very fabric of British society. Education reform became a particular focus. If the future of the kingdom depended on enlightened citizens, then access to learning had to expand beyond aristocratic boys and privileged circles. George supported initiatives to open schools in urban centres, particularly for the children of the burgeoning middle class and the working poor. Dr. Elizabeth Harrow helped craft curricula that included not just reading and writing, but practical knowledge about health, hygiene, and nutrition. This was revolutionary at a time when the poor were largely ignored by official educational policies. Meanwhile, public health campaigns gained momentum. Cholera and other diseases swept through crowded cities with devastating effect, and the king's interest in improving sanitation grew from his visits to hospitals and towns. The challenge of tradition. Not everyone welcomed these reforms. The landed aristocracy, deeply rooted in their privileges and ways of life, saw them as threats to the established order. The House of Lords, long resistant to change, became a battleground for ideas. Traditionalists argued that the king was overstepping, risking chaos by empowering commoners and meddling with matters best left to nature or God. Lady Margaret Fenwick and her faction, still bitter about losing influence, spearheaded much of this opposition, weaving their arguments with threats of instability and decline. Despite the pushback, George III stood firm. His speeches in Parliament, increasingly eloquent and resonant, emphasized the duty of the crown to protect not just wealth and power, but life itself. The influence of science and reason. The king's patronage of science blossomed into support for institutions such as the Royal Society and newly founded medical colleges. He saw the promise of reason as a guiding force that could lift the kingdom out of superstition and stagnation. Under his reign, medical research made strides. Treatments for common ailments improved, and the horrors of the past, endless bloodletting and poisonous concoctions, began to wane. The king's personal health regimen, guided by Dr. Harrow, became a model for the court and even the public. His example helped shift attitudes away from extremes toward moderation and care. A nation in flux, yet the broader world was changing too, and George III's reforms existed alongside deeper political upheavals. The American colonies, already restless and agitated, demanded rights and representation. The echoes of revolutions stirred in the air. Across the Channel, France marched steadily toward its own upheaval. George's reign would be marked not only by internal reform, but by the challenge of maintaining a fragile empire in a world in motion. His careful balancing act between reform and tradition, openness and authority, would be tested in ways no one could have predicted. The personal cost behind the grand vision of reform, the king bore private burdens. His mental health remained a delicate matter. The pressures of rulership, the memories of his grandfather's decline, and the weight of public expectation wore on him in quiet moments. He continued to rely heavily on trusted confidants like Dr. Harrow and Princess Amelia, whose steady presence grounded him. At times, the isolation was profound. Even surrounded by advisors and courtiers, the crown felt heavy and lonely. Yet George embraced his vulnerability as part of his strength, believing that only by acknowledging his limits could he govern wisely. Legacy in the making. As the 9th chapter of his reign unfolded, George III understood that the story of his monarchy would be written not by proclamations or portraits, but by the slow work of change in medicine, education, politics, and the hearts of his people. He had begun to transform the crown from a symbol of untouchable power into an emblem of shared humanity. Though the road ahead was uncertain and challenges loomed large, George III moved forward with determination and hope. The grandeur of George III's reforms and his personal battles unfolded against the sprawling backdrop of an empire stretched thin. Beyond the polished marble halls and bustling streets of London lay distant lands where the reach of the British crown was both celebrated and contested. The king was acutely aware that the strength of his realm depended not only on domestic progress, but also on the complex and often fraught relationships with colonies scattered across oceans. Whispers from across the Atlantic, the American colonies had long been a source of pride and tension. As new ideas of liberty and self-governance spread, the British Crown's authority faced growing resistance. Letters from colonial governors, reports from envoys, and dispatches from merchants painted a picture of unrest and mounting defiance. George, who prided himself on duty and order, struggled to reconcile his ideals of enlightened governance with the realities of empire. His advisers were divided. Some urged a firmer hand, demanding loyalty above all else. Others counseled compromise, recognizing that the old ways might no longer hold the burden of command. The king found himself caught between these factions. His own heart, once broken by physical ailment, now felt the strain of political fracture. In private, he wrote to his mother with a mixture of resolve and sorrow. The empire is vast, yet fragile. It is a tapestry of many threads, and each threatens to unravel if pulled too tight. He summoned his council repeatedly, weighing every decision with painstaking care. The echoes of his grandfather's frailty and the ridicule that followed haunted him still. He could not afford to falter. The role of the press and public opinion back in London, the growing power of the press shaped public perception of the American troubles. Pamphlets, newspapers, and coffeehouse debates fueled passions on both sides. Some writers portrayed the colonies as rebellious and ungrateful, while others sympathized with their calls for representation and fairness. George's royal press office worked tirelessly to control the narrative, but the tides of opinion were unpredictable. The human cost, the strains of empire were not just political, but deeply human. Soldiers stationed far from home faced harsh conditions. Colonial settlers navigated uncertain loyalties. Indigenous peoples found themselves caught in the crossfire of competing empires. George visited the newly established War Office, where he met with generals and heard first-hand accounts of battles and losses. These meetings deepened his understanding of the costs borne by individuals beneath the banner of the crown. Diplomacy and European eyes. Across Europe, the unfolding American crisis was watched closely. Monarchs and ministers speculated on the implications for their own realms. The French court, having mocked George's past weaknesses, now considered how to exploit the unrest to their advantage. Diplomatic correspondence grew more urgent, with Britain seeking allies and trying to contain the spread of revolutionary ideas. Personal reflections. Amidst these vast geopolitical challenges, George sought moments of quiet reflection. In his study, surrounded by books and letters, he pondered the meaning of power and legacy. He confided to Princess Amelia, "To rule is to bear the weight of countless lives, seen and unseen. It is a solitary path, but one I must walk with courage. Their conversations grew into a shared vision of a monarchy that could adapt and endure, not by force alone, but through wisdom and empathy. A kingdom at a crossroads. The 10th chapter of George III's reign closed with the kingdom poised at a crossroads. His reforms had begun to reshape society at home, but the fate of the empire hung in the balance. Would the crown hold firm, bending with the winds of change, or would it break beneath the storm? George faced these questions with the same resolve that had carried him through illness and scandal, aware that history's judgment would be shaped by the choices made in this turbulent time. The rumblings of discontent that had long echoed from the American colonies now erupted into a full blaze of rebellion. What began as a series of protests over taxes and representation quickly spiraled into open conflict, challenging not only the authority of the British Crown, but the very notion of empire itself. George III, seated in the quiet grandeur of his palace, watched these events unfold with a mixture of disbelief and grim resolve. The legacy of his ancestors and his own carefully nurtured reforms were at stake. The Declaration and its reverberations. In July of 1776, news arrived that shook the foundations of the monarchy. The American colonies had declared independence. The words of the Declaration of Independence, with their lofty claims of liberty and rights, reverberated through the court and the streets alike. Some hailed them as the birth of a new era. Others condemned them as rebellion and treason. George was not a man given to theatrics, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon him. In a private audience with his council, he spoke with quiet fury and sorrow. They have broken their oaths and severed the bonds of loyalty. Yet as king, I must seek a path to restore unity without forsaking justice. The war's toll. The conflict quickly escalated into a brutal war across vast distances. British soldiers faced unfamiliar terrain and determined foes, while American militias fought with fierce resolve and local knowledge. News of battles lost and lives sacrificed reached the king in waves. Each report chipped away at his hopes for a swift resolution. At court, tension ran high. Factions emerged, hawks pressing for harsher military measures, doves urging negotiation and reconciliation. George found himself navigating these turbulent waters with the same care he applied to his personal health, a balance between strength and caution. The strain on the monarchy, the war's pressures, extended beyond the battlefield. The economic cost strained Britain's treasury. Political divisions deepened within Parliament, and the king's image suffered both at home and abroad. Pamphlets and newspapers questioned his leadership. Satirists revived old caricatures of the king who died from too much poop, now recast as a monarch unable to hold his empire, yet George refused to yield to despair. In private, he confided to Princess Amelia, "The crown endures not because it is unbreakable, but because those who bear it are unyielding." Diplomacy and alliances. Recognizing the shifting tides, George and his advisors sought to isolate the American rebellion by courting European allies. The French, eager to weaken Britain, openly supported the colonies, sending troops and supplies. This foreign intervention complicated the war and expanded its scope, turning it into a global conflict. George's diplomatic efforts focused on forging alliances of his own and negotiating with cautious pragmatism. The human cost at home back in London, the war's toll was felt in every household. Families lost sons and fathers. Communities mourned. Soldiers returned with wounds seen and unseen. The king visited military hospitals and met with wounded veterans, his empathy deepening his commitment to care for all subjects. Dr. Harrow's innovations in medicine and convalescence became vital. Her work saving lives and easing suffering was among the few bright spots in a dark time. Reflections in the quiet moments of solitude, George contemplated the paradox of his reign. A monarch advancing reform and compassion, yet presiding over a devastating war that threatened to unravel his kingdom. He wrestled with questions of power, justice, and destiny. Is it possible, he wondered aloud to Amelia, to be both king and servant, to hold authority without crushing the spirit of those who seek freedom? These reflections marked a turning point, a recognition that the monarchy itself must evolve or risk becoming obsolete. The king's resolve, as part 11 of his reign closed, George III recommitted himself to his role with renewed vigor. He would fight to preserve the unity of the realm, but not blindly. His reforms, his openness to new ideas, and his personal journey through vulnerability and strength would shape how he faced the challenges ahead. The story of the king who had once been mocked was now one of resilience, of a crown tested by fire and tempered by the lessons of both history and humanity. While the American Revolution raged across the ocean, shaking the foundations of empire, a quieter but no less profound storm was brewing within the heart of Britain itself. The nation's soul was in flux, and George III faced not only the challenges of war abroad, but the rising voices calling for transformation at home. Stirring voices of reform across cities and towns, a new generation of thinkers and activists began to demand political and social reforms that went beyond the king's initial efforts. Workers, merchants, and intellectuals gathered in salons and public houses, discussing ideas of representation, rights and equality. Pamphlets circulated widely, some praising the ideals of liberty espoused by the American rebels, others warning of chaos if change was left unchecked. Even in Parliament, debates grew more heated. Some conservatives clung tightly to tradition, fearing the consequences of too much reform. Others pushed for gradual expansion of voting rights and legal protections. George III watched these developments warily. He supported measured progress, but feared the radicalism that might tear the kingdom apart. The role of Princess Amelia, ever the king's confidant and advisor, played a crucial role in bridging the divides. She moved deftly through court and city alike, advocating for education, charity, and dialogue. Her patronage of institutions for the poor and her efforts to improve women's access to learning earned her admiration and respect. Through letters and private conversations, she urged the king to listen, not just to his advisers, but to the people themselves. The rise of a new parliament pressure mounted for parliamentary reform. The current system, dominated by aristocrats and often riddled with corruption, was increasingly out of step with Britain's evolving society. Calls for rotten boroughs to be abolished and for more equitable representation grew louder. In response, George reluctantly endorsed a commission to investigate and propose changes. This marked a significant shift, a recognition that the monarchy must adapt or risk alienation. the unrest of the working class, yet not all unrest could be contained within the walls of parliament or salons. Industrialization was beginning to transform Britain's economy, drawing masses into cities and factories. Working conditions were harsh, wages low, and social safety nets nearly non-existent. Strikes and protests erupted sporadically, signaling deep dissatisfaction. George, informed by his advisers and moved by Amelia's appeals, advocated for reforms that would improve workers' lives, though he faced fierce resistance from business interests. The influence of Enlightenment thought. The ideas fueling these changes were not merely political, but philosophical. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, human rights, and scientific progress, permeated British intellectual life. Figures like Dr. Harrow and other scholars inspired new ways of thinking about governance and society. George's own education and patronage aligned him with these currents, even as he sought to maintain order. The challenge of tradition and stability, balancing innovation with stability, was George's greatest challenge. He knew that rapid upheaval risked chaos, yet stagnation bred resentment and decay. In private, he confided, "A monarch's crown is forged in the fires of change. Too cold and it shatters, too hot and it burns." His speeches increasingly called for unity, a nation bound by respect, progress, and shared duty. Seeds of a modern nation. As Part 12 drew to a close, Britain stood at the threshold of a new era. The monarchy, long seen as an immutable symbol, was becoming an institution capable of evolution. The king's health and spirit, once fragile, now seemed intertwined with the fate of his kingdom. The reforms he championed and the challenges he faced at home would shape the future long after his reign ended. While the public gaze remained fixed on the grand dramas of empire and reform, within the ornate chambers of the palace, another world unfolded, a realm of private struggles, whispered secrets, and quiet resilience that shaped the king and his reign as much as any battle or decree. The weight of legacy George III often found himself wrestling not only with external pressures, but the invisible weight of family legacy. The ghost of his grandfather, whose final days had been marked by vulnerability and whispered scandal, lingered in the corridors of power. Despite his efforts to craft a new image of regal strength and dignity, George could not fully escape the shadow cast by that earlier reign. In his most private moments, he feared that history might remember him not for his reforms or resilience, but for the frailty that had once defined his family. The role of Princess Amelia was not only a public advocate, but a steadfast companion and advisor in these moments of doubt. Their relationship, forged through shared grief and hope, was a cornerstone of the king's emotional survival. She listened patiently to his fears, offered counsel steeped in wisdom, and reminded him of his strength. Her presence was a reminder that the monarchy was not a solitary burden, but a shared commitment. Court, intrigue and loyalties, yet palace life was far from serene. Court politics buzzed beneath the surface, with factions vying for influence over the king and the direction of the realm. Advisers jostled for favor, and rumors of betrayal and ambition stirred unrest. George's trust was hard-earned and cautiously given. He relied on a small circle of loyal confidants, among them Dr. Harrow, whose medical care had become essential, and Sir Edmund, a diplomat whose steady hand guided foreign affairs. The Queen's quiet strength, Queen Charlotte, often overshadowed by the King's public persona, wielded a quiet but formidable influence behind the scenes. Her unwavering support provided George with solace and stability. She managed the domestic sphere with grace, overseeing charitable works and the education of their children, while also serving as a mediator within the court's turbulent environment. Their partnership was a testament to the power of personal unity amid political uncertainty. The children and the future, the royal children, many of whom would go on to shape British history, grew up under the watchful eyes of their parents and tutors. George's hopes for his heirs extended beyond mere succession. He envisioned a dynasty capable of adapting to the changing world, educated, compassionate, and prepared to lead with both tradition and innovation. The family's private letters reveal a king who cherished moments of laughter and tenderness, even as the weight of empire bore down. The burden of illness returns despite his outward vigor. George's health remained a persistent concern. Periods of weakness and fatigue reminded him of his own mortality. Medical advancements and the care of Dr. Harrow provided relief, but not cure. These moments deepened his empathy for subjects afflicted by illness and aging. Reflections on power and humanity. George's private writings reveal a man grappling with the paradox of power, the ability to command armies and enact laws, yet powerless against time and the frailty of the human body. He mused, to be king is to hold the world in one hand, and yet feel the frailty of a single heart within. These reflections colored his approach to governance, tempered by humility and a desire to serve. Preparing for the future as Part 13 closed, the king turned his attention increasingly toward legacy. He sought to ensure that the monarchy and the nation it symbolized could endure the coming century's challenges. His private efforts to strengthen family bonds, encourage education, and nurture loyalty within the court were as vital as any public policy. The story of George III was no longer only about a king's illness or empire's trials. It was about the enduring human spirit behind the crown. As the years passed, the relentless passage of time weighed heavily upon George III. The king, who had once battled illness, scandal, rebellion, and reform, now faced the inevitable twilight of his reign, a period marked by personal decline and the shifting tides of a nation on the cusp of modernity, the return of shadows in his later years. George's health deteriorated again, this time more visibly and irrevocably. The king's episodes of mental distress returned with alarming frequency, casting a pall over court life and igniting whispers among courtiers and physicians alike. Despite advances in medical understanding and the devoted care of Dr. Harrow, the nature of his illness, what some now suspected as hereditary, was poorly understood and deeply feared. The Regency crisis. The king's incapacitation precipitated a constitutional crisis. Parliament and the royal family debated the need for a regency, a temporary transfer of royal powers to the Prince of Wales. This period exposed deep fissures within the monarchy and government, as different factions vied to influence the prince and the direction of the kingdom. George, though mentally unwell, remained fiercely aware of his royal dignity and resisted the idea of abdication or permanent removal. The Prince of Wales and the Crown. The Prince of Wales, later George IV, assumed regency duties with a blend of ambition and excess. His contrasting temperament and lifestyle set the stage for future tensions within the monarchy. The older king's legacy, rooted in discipline and reform, seemed to clash with the prince's flamboyance and indulgence. This dynamic would shape public perceptions of the monarchy for decades to come. The public's changing view. While the king's illness elicited sympathy from many, it also fueled new waves of satire and skepticism. Pamphlets and caricatures once again revisited themes of royal frailty, but now, with a tone tinged with melancholy, the public grappled with the humanity behind the crown, recognizing that even the mightiest were subject to vulnerability and decline. Kingdom in transition. George III's later reign coincided with profound changes in British society. The Industrial Revolution accelerated, altering the economic and social landscape. Political reforms gained momentum, and ideas of democracy and individual rights took deeper root. The monarchy, once the unquestioned center of power, found itself negotiating a new role in a changing world. The king's final years. Despite his illness, George remained a figure of symbolic strength. His family and loyal courtiers ensured his dignity was preserved, shielding him from the harsher realities of public scrutiny. Private moments revealed a man longing for peace, comforted by family and faith. Princess Amelia's earlier efforts to safeguard his legacy now took on greater urgency, as those closest to the king sought to shape history's memory. The end of an era. George III passed away with little public fanfare, but immense historical significance. His reign, marked by brilliance and hardship, progress and turmoil, closed a chapter on an age of empire, enlightenment, and revolution. The crown he left behind bore the marks of his struggles and triumphs, a symbol both of enduring tradition and the necessity of change. Legacy and reflection. In the years following his death, historians, writers, and politicians grappled with the complexity of George's life and reign. Was he a monarch undone by his body and the tides of history, or a visionary who laid foundations for a modern nation? The answer, like the king himself, defied simple judgment, woven from contradictions, resilience, and the inexorable march of time. The final chapter of George III's story is not simply about a monarch's death. It is about the enduring legacy of a reign marked by profound change, personal struggle, and the indelible imprint left on a nation and its people. A legacy carved. In contrasts, George III's life was a tapestry woven from contradictions, a king mocked for bodily frailty, yet admired for mental resilience, a ruler of a vast empire facing the loss of its American colonies. Traditional monarch embracing reform and Enlightenment ideals. His story reminds us that history rarely offers simple heroes or villains, only humans shaped by their time and trials. The crown and the people. Perhaps George's greatest achievement was the subtle transformation of the monarchy from a distant, almost untouchable institution into a symbol more intimately connected with the people. Through his struggles and reforms, he set the stage for a constitutional monarchy that balanced power with accountability, remembering the man behind the myth beyond politics and empire. George III was a man who faced illness with dignity, who loved his family fiercely, and who grappled with the burdens of rule with humility. His life reminds us that even those who wear crowns are subject to the same frailties and hopes as all humans. The story lives on. The whispered rumors and satirical poems may have faded, but they gave way to deeper understanding. The marble plaque in the quiet chapel, the letters of Princess Amelia, the medical debates and reforms, all these threads weave a richer portrait of a king and a time. A final thought as we close this tale. We are left with the truth as old as history itself. Power may shape events, but it is the stories we tell of courage, failure, love, and loss that truly endure. George III's story belongs to all who listen, who question, and who remember. Thank you for joining this journey. Thank you for walking through the corridors of history with me, for meeting the king behind the crown, and for exploring the complex world of the king who died from too much poop. May this story inspire curiosity and compassion for the past, for its people, and for ourselves. Until next time, may your own story be told with courage and grace.